Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move us to the left section, or at least the section on my left. I also want to apologize because we have a lot of people seated in the upper section, but I don't think we have mics there. But let's see if we have time to get a couple of comments from you. So go ahead, please.
Hi,
what would you put on the agenda for the dialogue? Introduce yourself first.
My name is Neha. I'm a PhD scholar at SOAS in London. And I actually I'm wondering whether we're even preempting this discussion, because I wonder how many of us are even engaging with movements. When we have the way the funding scenario, having projects coming in, engaging with men primarily or particularly only in the area of behavior change, having these role models coming in, expecting men to change without touching even the P of patriarchy is very problematic. And I really wonder, we need to think about whether we are willing to engage with movements, and not just one movement, but a cross-section of movements.
Good point. Thank you. Who is next?
My name is Mbwiselo. I'm from South Africa. I want to put into the agenda that men engage. Its leadership should reflect the struggles, pains, frustration of the women's movement. The danger is that if it's us listening to ourselves, we may fall into the trap of recreating, reliving, and talking and listening to each other. It's about time that we become humble and say, in very practical terms, men must give up leadership. Men must ensure that it's not only the talk, but we walk the talk. In the liberation struggle in South Africa, there was a conscious decision that the liberation movement will be led by black African people. For the simple basic reason, it is them who understood their struggles. It is them who knew, in fact, what it meant to be black in an apartheid South Africa. It is women throughout the world who understand what it means to be a woman, what it means to be oppressed. So the question of leadership should never escape this agenda.
Good, thank you.
So, hi, I'm Lori Heisey, and I'm a researcher at the London School of Hygiene, and I'm also co-chair of a feminist movement building organization called JAZZ.
Which I'm the other co-chair.
Of which, yes, of which Srilata is the other co-chair. I would like to put on the agenda a task, which I think could be useful, because I tend to think, in my experience, that when people actually work on something together, it is a way to start to work out the differences and the kinks. And I think a task that we could take on, and it could be framed in various different ways, but I would like us as a community to develop a set of principles that guide both our programming and work, things around language, around leadership, around some of the issues, funding, that have been quite potentially divisive. But I think even more important, I would like a set of principles that we ask donors to sign on to. Because I really do agree with Dean that some of what is exacerbating tensions that already exist is the influx of money for the first time into this field and how donors are choosing to deploy very big sums of money. And I think that it's distorting for lots of reasons. One, they won't fund movement building. Two, they are funding, PricewaterhouseCoopers, whatever. But I do think we could put pressure, especially on those donors that are now taking a stand and getting credit internationally, like DFID and others, for their work on violence against women and gender and adolescent girls, and really sort of hold them accountable to a set of principles as well. And I think it would help because it would create more space. People are much more I find that dialogue is easier when people aren't fighting for funding. You can be far more generous when both sides feel like they can survive.
Thank you. Great point, Ravi. Anyone else? We'll take the last couple of comments. Yes.
Hello to everybody. I'm Govinda Dhawal from Nepal. I'm working for women empowerment with Care Nepal. I would like to put 2-3 agendas to lead ahead the movement of men engagement for gender justice and gender equality. First, according to the context and environment as well as social and political situation of a country, religious and caste systems should be operationalized. Because there are different kinds of harmful practices and superstitious customs and tradition due to harmful religious systems. And it is deeply rooted to take place to create caste systems that is bringing racial suppression and oppression. And next, I would like to raise question to develop a framework having decentralization, the issue of gender equality. I have learned and participated in a conference of national level in Nepal, that is Beijing Plus 20 workshop review. Beijing Plus 20, Beijing platform is leading in its 20s, but in grassroots level, what is B Plus 20? What is Beijing Plus 20 platform? It is not known by common people. So decentralization of movement should be done. And one more, it is third day in this symposium, and maybe I am in dilemma. What is the actual meaning of men engagement? Maybe I am in dilemma. Because presentation shows, different kinds of presentation shows, men are helping to empower women, men are fetching water to their wives, men are cooking when their wives are sick. So that is men engagement. It is the actual meaning of men engagement. So the definition, introductions should be given of real men engagement. And one more thing, that men engagement, as Kamala Vasini, Didi, sisters raised the question, that should be against patriarchy. That should change the pre-mindset of men. And their movement should be against violence activities that is happening in our day-to-day life in our societies. And men should be ready, by their heart and their mind to lead ahead the moment of symposium. So the agenda should be put for discussion and to develop framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that a hand I see at the back? Yeah, there's. Please.
I'm Dr. Neerashka, and I'm part of the health movement, women's movement, and right to food movement. I just come back from Jantar Mantar, where the Bhopal gas victims who, we call them Bhopal gas survivors of the tragedy, is 30 years. What were the forces? why the tragedy took place. You know, and like it was discussed earlier, the whole patriarchal thinking of the corporate control and etc. But worse is the denial of justice, even today. So I would like to just somewhere that there are men, women and children. So how men should engage, how women should engage. The issue is how as human beings we recognize the human beings there whose pain, you know, gets blind spotted. And the 1,000 tons of toxic effluents are lying there, you know, covered up. 370 tons in the Union Carbide factory. They have not been removed, so second generation congenital malformation continuing. So my humble request is the tragedies that unfold and what are the forces that lead to it? What are the forces that deny the justice? And unless these things are addressed by men, women, human beings, by everybody together, without anything being divisive, I think it would be extremely important. So when we're talking about gender justice, we are also talking about every other form of justice. And 30 years of the Bhopal gas victims and the blind spotting by society is too much. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Hello.
There's one more hand at the back. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, and then we pass it to the gentleman in the blue shirt at the back.
I'm Draško Kostovski from Hera, Macedonia. I don't want to deny the different discussions, the diversities that we have on this table here. But actually, I'm more worried about new tendencies, especially those that are happening in Europe. The neoliberalism actually has a new face, and different forms. The money that we need to do something and to go further are actually given and spent by organizations that have completely different position than ours. They have retrogressive position. They want to return the patriarchy. So that is really happening now at the moment, especially in Europe. There is a conservative wave. This is supported by the selected representatives, by the general public. So again, we are living in a post-feministic time. We need to queering what we are doing as a policies, and that's why I think that solidarity is the most important thing. We need to establish solidarity, but also to change our discourse and to find a way how other organizations who are using human rights, who are using the United Nations mechanism for human rights, are actually working against our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Back there, the blue shirt. Yeah.
Hello, Tim. Hello? Hi. Tim Shan, I'm a PhD student based out of Malawi. It's a real privilege to be able to have this conversation, so thank you to the panelists. One of the notes that I've been making to myself at the top of my great notepad over the last few days is, have we become too middle class as a movement? And, and I say that as a paid-up member of the establishment of the white male middle class, but, I guess my question to the panel is, what space is there for conversations around poverty, class inequities, and unemployment in a conversation between organizations working for men and gender equality and organizations working as part of the women's movement, understanding the complexity of that mix? Because I sometimes wonder that our conversations around what may differ allow us to lose track of, I think, the fact that on the ground the realities of a poor man and a poor woman are often pretty similar, and that actually there's a much bigger fight, as other panelists other speakers have mentioned, but at that level. And so my call to all of us would be, let's focus on that bigger challenge of poverty and inequities rather than what divides us as movements. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one last speaker here in the aisle here. Someone can pass her a mic.
My name is Arundhati, and I come from a social movement as a feminist coming from movements. I share what Bianca has said, and actually want to echo what what are the, because people have talked about the feminist issue. They really want to know. Do the issues of the inequality, the whole neoliberalization, the whole models, are they feminist issue or not? Many a time, many of the feminists, many of us who have faced the violence within the social movements, there has been a response from the feminist movements as a more of the solidarity only for the issue of the violence. In terms of the sexual violence, whether any one of us have faced molestation or any of our activists have faced rape or there have been, severe physical violence, but not to the issues for which we stand for. So as a many time as a feminist working in a social movement, I always had this question whether, whether when I am been molested, whether I should raise that question, because am I just going to get one solidarity statement, or are the people feminist movement, and I'm talking both of men and women both. I do not see any difference. I think the men engage, also people who want to engage, whoever is against patriarchy. Are we looking at the whole model of the neoliberalization, the whole issue? I do not see any echo here. And the second thing, whatever relationship so far has been extremely patronizing. And I remember seeing, activists who have been raped and who have raised these issues, and they're absolutely, except for a, solidarity presence for half an hour in organizations, dharnas and demonstration. There have been no, so where are we going to engage? And then we all talk about then, the whole coming up of the centralist forces, because we do not have echo. So when are we going to start this dialogue, which is actually between, I think also the feminists, I think all the social movements which are fighting against the inequality are the feminist movement, because they talk about against the whole patriarchal neoliberal model. So I think there has been no relationship, and when are we going to start that dialogue? Are we ever going to, and I think I totally agree, it has become more middle class, it has actually more into the more cocoon, we do not have a language to share with the tribals and Dalits, and that is the reality. And let's accept that and find out how do we move forward and move from this forward.
Great, thank you. So, I think you should be satisfied. You've had 40 minutes. And you've used it really well. So is it okay if I come back to the panel now? You're so kind. And then I'll reserve maybe the last 5 minutes for a few comments from my humble self. So I open it to whoever on the panel would like to react or respond or add or elaborate on any of the issues that are I can see extremely engaged and excited audience has put on the table, impassioned audience. So anybody, whoever would like to begin?
Let me respond to what I thought
Sure.
were the issues. There was a question here which I think was important, and I think it ties up with the question, with the point raised from the other end. One thing that, and the last statement made by Arundhati, if you look at the women's movement as standing for all margins, not just for women, it stands for all margins. It is oppositional to any form of power that is arbitrarily exercised, and it is something that is against the hegemony that has been held by a whole range of congealed sets of power, mainly held by men, even though that is only a fraction of men, because many men are disempowered. Many men are disempowered, and many men are actually not in the classic box of the patriarchy that we would like to address, even though there's a little bit of patriarchy in a lot of men, despite the fact that they are marginalized in some ways. I think the point there is that we also have to learn how to not drop the question of even as you say, we need to start having dialogues and discussions between different segments of the groups that have felt marginalized, is that we also need to find a single collective way of engaging in politics. So in that sense, I think the Dalit feminist standpoint that Sharmila Rege wrote about, which was an attempt at everybody being able to locate themselves in the Dalit feminist box and then respond to politics from that margin, is the way we need to go, because we cannot do separate politics. We have to do a collective politics, and that collective politics has to hit at the way in which old margins existed and new margins are being created. So whether it's new liberalization, whether it's new forms by which the poverty is being exacerbated, there are margins that are growing, and we need to be able to, as a feminist, democratic, equalitarian constituency, we need to hit back, and we need to be able to do a single politics that takes us forward. So I would say that speaking for locating ourselves in all margins, being able to take all men who are willing to stand with us in those margins, that is the way in which we have to do our politics.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, one, please.
Yes, I have a lot of notes for the content of a dialogue, but I would like to suggest that we really dialogue. That means when you dialogue, it's supposed that you listen to somebody else. And when you listen to somebody else, you take distance of yourself. And I think that if we really dialogue, we will learn to take conscious of ourselves. I would like to suggest what I call the interactive gender mirrors. That means, how can we relate with a mirror, but dialoguing with a mirror, taking distance from ourselves, no? But because if not, we are going to give a list, a big list of what can be good for dialoguing. But what I want to suggest, and I want to emphasize, is that we dialogue about the things that we have been saying in this panel. No?
Thank you. Vince?
Thank you. I'm not going to ask a question back, but sometimes I get the feeling that when we are talking about movements, that they become an end in themselves, that it is not moving us forward to an end point and a goal at the end of it all. The personal is political, somebody said. Some of us got involved in the movement, not because of anything else, but because of our own particular experiences that are informed by a sense of justice. And I will tell you that the broader issue for me is always going to be social justice for all, irrespective of the color of your skin, or the trousers or the skirt that you wear, or whatever the case may be. And that's why I've always maintained in the discourse on equality that women should never aspire to be equal to men, because the standard against which equality in that sense will be measured will be a male standard. And I don't think it's a very good standard. But what is important is that we, men and women, should aspire to be equal to each other. And the standard against which that equality will be measured is called humanity.
Yes.
Because that is what will make men and women to enter into the dialogue. if we look at each other as people that pain equally, hurt equally, get hungry equally, can get power and exercise power, can abuse power equally, then we are talking.
I think that hearing all these interventions, I was thinking that it is very important that we increase our professionalism in the work that we every day do. But in many cases, we are so focused in one specific issue that we are interested or working with that we do not see the whole conditions or the new approaches or new problems that come out in our own environment. I mean, it has been mentioned, the conflicts, migrations, and something related to frontiers. And I think that in many cases, these are urgent situations that we just leave it out because we are very occupied with those things that we're doing every day. And I think that we have to be much more sharp and deeper in our approaches so that we can really take in count these urgent necessities, these urgent actions that we need to be involved with. And because we are thinking about social transformation, not only in working one specific issue that we're interested in. We need to not to lose that wide social perspective in which we can really contribute for the transformation of or the building of a new world.
Thank you. Dean, and then we'll conclude.
So yeah, this was
as
a
brief as
fantastic
possible.
discussion.
Yes.
Sorry?
As briefly as possible.
Sure.
Thank you.
So a few quick points. One, I think it's worth remembering the history of the early work with men and boys, which was very much at the request of women's rights organizations.
Exactly. Thank you.
And I think many of the organizations that continue to do this work, whether it's the Men's Association in Nicaragua, working with Puntos de Encuentros, organization established by feminist activists, said to the men, we need you to do something with men and men's violence. And that's true across the world. South Africa, ADAPT, many, many places that's the case. The organization I first started to work with, Men Overcoming Violence in San Francisco, coming out of that tradition. So I think it's worth remembering that, and that still shapes the work. Second thing I wanted to say is I think it's important that we have conceptual clarity about what we're talking about when we talk about masculinities work. In my mind, masculinity is a useful lens through which to look at the problem. I don't think it is a useful way to assert and articulate the solution. I quite like the articulation earlier that in some ways what we're trying to do is reduce masculinities. We're saying, as a colleague of ours, Funeka Soldat, said in South Africa, gender is one piece of her complex identity. It's not the only piece. And I think sometimes we run the risk of reinscribing the centrality of fixed gender identity. So I think we've got a more ambitious, more emancipatory project than that, which is to free people up to experience a multitude of identities, some of which have to do with gender, some of which have to do with other things. And then the backlash question, the question that Mfana Shozi from our Commission for Gender Equality put to us, I think part of our work as people doing work with men and boys is to be in those spaces and to push back hard. So there is an organization recently established in South Africa that is explicitly an anti-women's rights, backlash, men's privilege group. The Commission for Gender Equality invited us and other women's rights organizations into a meeting with them where we were able to push back very hard. We do that in the media a lot. My colleagues Des and Mbuyiselo spend a lot of time deliberately in spaces with quite conservative men's organizations to influence and infuse their agenda with increasingly feminist sensibility. So I think that's critical work. Part of our responsibility is to push back hard against backlash organizations. And lastly, on the funding issue, I think it's worth keeping in mind some of the numbers that we know about, the most generous and consistent donor around the work with men and boys for gender equality has been the Swedish government, at least in my experience. Significant part of this conference funded by Swedish CEDA. Paul Dover, who was a champion of this work and recently died, unfortunately, produced a paper just in the last really months of his life in which he analyzed the amount of money of gender work that was going to the work with men and boys by what I think we would all recognize as one of the most supportive of the donors working with men and boys. Less than 1% of CEDA's gender work goes to work with men and boys. And I think that's an important number to keep in mind, because I do think sometimes we have skewed perspectives based on meetings like this that happen once every 3 to 5 years, and we walk away with the sense that it represents a very significant drain on gender equality and women's rights resources. I think we want to make sure that doesn't happen, but our assessment is that that's not currently the case. So I think it's useful to provide some numbers so that we have a sense of what that looks like. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's finally my turn, and I was congratulating myself on excellent time management, and I now see we're 5 minutes over time on my watch. But bear with me, I'll maybe take not more than 3 or 4, which is actually doing an injustice, because what I'm doing is also trying to synthesize what I've heard coming through this amazing and I think very rich discussion on what's on the agenda. And forgive me if I've missed some very key points. I think the thing that I'd like to put on the agenda, so let me start with something I wanted to say, is that before we get carried away with all this talk of working on masculinity and with men and boys and so on, let's not forget, and this really does go to the resource question, that we haven't finished working with women. That women are actually among the strongest soldiers of patriarchy. Patriarchy is carried forward in most cultures by women. So let's not forget that while working with men and boys is very important, working on masculinities is extremely critical, but we cannot stop resourcing or paying attention to the kinds of transformative work with women that still needs resources and still needs to be done. So when we're talking about, developing a shared agenda to go to donors with, I think this has to be a critical part of the agenda. That we work with women, which AVID research has shown is on the one hand declining for transformative women's empowerment work, which really tries to address some of the internalized patriarchal attitudes, etc., and the way women reproduce patriarchy. But on the other hand, instrumental work with women, magic bullet work with women. Give her a loan and she'll change the world. Send her to school and she's going to change her whole village. This kind of work is getting more resources. So it's not just about the he for she, but it's also the she for everyone. Invest in that single woman rather than in processes of building collective power. So I want to just add this. I think we have to have a dialogue with all our allied social movements as women's movements on how can we not lose sight of this fundamental reality. Clearly what you're bringing to the agenda are the following. Let's talk about patriarchy. It's really time we talked about our different understandings of patriarchy, or whether we understand patriarchy at all, or whether we are understanding it through some outdated frameworks and outdated analytical tools that are really irrelevant in the modern context at a global level, given the whole global crisis and the development paradigm, but also let's talk about patriarchy in very, very specific rooted contexts and what that's about, and what is it that we're trying to change in that context. You're talking about putting on the agenda another huge task, which is let's talk about moving beyond gender. Let's talk about how do we move beyond this binary, and in fact, how do we construct new visions of an ungendered humanity, as Beans called it. How do we create an imagination and a vision of an ungendered society wherever we are located? What does that look like? We're talking about resources. Let's sit down and talk about resources, where they are going, where they aren't going, and let's build a shared agenda around the resource question. Let's build new frameworks, new framings about what is our vision of development? What kind of economies and societies do we want to live in? So we can't have the conversation about patriarchy disconnected from our visions of development and resources. So we have to root that. We also need to have a conversation about language and the frameworks that our language conveys. We're talking about difficult things, as my friend here put it. It's about self-interrogation. And here we have an appeal from a young activist that there is a need for self-interrogation within feminists, among women's movements, and self-interrogation within other social movements about what they're really doing and where they really stand on issues of deeply internalized patriarchies and the practices that emerge and the reproduction of those patterns of power. So we have to talk about some difficult and painful things. And then my friend Laurie says, one thing we can do is not just talk together, but let's do some things together. So maybe there are some actual concrete projects that we need to engage in. Maybe one project is as simple as finding new language. In ABID, I know we've been struggling with the issue of how do we stop talking about just women. And we've come up with some very awkward formulations at the moment, women and other oppressed genders. But we know that in some contexts, and of course, based on class, caste, ethnicity, race, etc., men are also oppressed, but as someone said on the panel, not necessarily by virtue of gender. I think one mentioned this. But I think we have to begin to think about some doable projects so that the dialogue is not just about some deep conceptual issues and framings, but also about doing something together. A dialogue that's framed through action. And often it's that process that unveils and reveals the limits to our possibility for collaboration and the limits to our unity, but also new possibilities. Now, the question that then arises, and that I ask you to take home with you tonight, and that Men Engage can also perhaps put into the agenda, is who would we trust to build and convene these dialogues? It's sometimes very hard to have a dialogue unless we have a neutral, convener or interlocutor. So who are they? Who amongst us will have the courage to begin to build these dialogue processes in our own organizations, in our own movements, with others who we see as allies and whom we should have at the table? Finally, I just want to end with a piece of wisdom that I learned from my great father, Amulya Reddy, who was a great guru of the sustainable energy field, a thinker before his time. And it's a very powerful statement, but I think a very good one to place before you at the end of this plenary, which is that you always have to remember that you have to march with others if you want them to march with you. So let's think about who are we willing to march with, who are perhaps not our immediate allies, not allies we are currently engaged with, but people on the margins, as Omar said, that we will go out and march with because we want them to march for us. Thank you very much.